The following program, Search the Scriptures, is brought to you by the Highway 5 South Church of Christ in Mountain Home. Speakers are Keith Sharp and Trevor Campbell. We invite you to call or write the church to submit questions for the speakers to answer. We'll provide answers from the Bible to your questions.
Trevor, if it was scriptural to use instrumental music in worship under the Old Testament, and if there are harps in heaven, why can't we use instrumental music in worship to God today?
Well, that's a good question, but the Bible answers that very nicely for us. Yeah.
All right, we'll talk about that this evening. Good evening, I'm Keith Sharp. With me on the program is Trevor Campbell. Trevor, would you please introduce yourself and the brethren in Payette?
You bet. Yeah, my name is Trevor Campbell, and I do worship and preach in Payette on Highway 62. On the north side of the highway is where we meet. We're right next to the new Dollar General, so we're pretty easy to find. And if you'd like to contact me, there's my number on the screen, 870-435-2737. Call me there if you have a question about the church that meets there, or if you have a question you'd like Keith and I to discuss on this program.
And of course, my name is Keith Sharp, and I preach at the Highway 5 South Church of Christ in Mountain Home. We invite you to our services. When the pandemic is not going on, we have our services at 10 o'clock on Sunday morning for Bible class, at 11 o'clock on Sunday morning for worship assembly. We'll meet again at 2 o'clock on Sunday afternoon. And then on Wednesday evening, we meet at 7 o'clock for Bible class and worship. We also, of course, have a ladies' Bible class that will be meeting at 10 o'clock on Wednesday morning. You're invited to all of these services of the Highway 5 South Church of Christ. To get to our building, we meet 1 mile south of the Highway 62 412 bypass on Highway 5 on the way to Salesville. So just turn off to the south on Highway 5 and go 1 mile, go past Good Samaritan on the right, look for our sign, Highway 5 South Church of Christ on the left, and come meet with us for services. Now, the subject matter on this program is generated by the questions that you, the audience, ask. And so we ask you, please, to let us know what your questions are so we can answer them from the Bible. We won't tell you what our opinions are. We won't tell you what a church creed says. We'll tell you what the Bible says concerning your question. If you have a question for me, then you can call me at 870-321-5746. Or if you prefer, you can email me at keithsharp2021@gmail.com, or you can write, if you prefer, to Post Office Box 263 in Mountain Home, 72654. Let us know what your question is. Well, Trevor, we do have a question that was given to me by a gentleman. The question is, why don't we have instrumental music in worship, since it was approved under the Old Testament and there are harps in heaven? Well, Trevor, tell us about that.
All right, it's a good question, and you know, in the question he said that the Old Testament approved instruments in worship, but really it did more than that. God actually commanded it. But I actually wanted to start with the harps in heaven, and I'd like to talk about that, at least for my portion of this discussion, because harps, historically in the Bible, harps began back there in Genesis chapter 4. They can be traced, that is, back to Genesis chapter 4, where Jubal, who was a descendant of Cain, the Bible says was the father of all those who play the harp and the flute. So a harp is an instrument that was invented by man. So, you know, if we say that there are harps in heaven, then we are saying that there are man-made objects, man-made inventions in heaven. Well, heaven is a spiritual place. The heavenly places, as the Bible speaks of them, God is spirit. Jesus told the Samaritan woman at the well in John chapter 4, that God is spirit. Those who worship Him must worship in spirit and in truth. So we're saying that man-made inventions would be in heaven. You know, there is mention of harps in the book of Revelation, and I think that's where that idea comes from, of harps being in heaven. But I'm going to go to Revelation chapter 1 just briefly to begin with, and then I'll go to a passage in Revelation that deals with harps. So in Revelation chapter 1, a very, very important passage in the book of Revelation is verse 1. It's very important. It cannot be overlooked. It says, "The revelation of Jesus Christ, which God gave Him to show His servants things which must shortly take place. and he sent and signified it by his angel to his servant John. Now, the verbiage that's used there in the Greek language, the word signified, in the context is referring to figurative language. And so throughout the book of Revelation, we have to respect that. If Jesus said, I gave this in signs and symbolism, in other words, in figurative language, then we have to respect what Jesus has said. And it's not up to us to go through the book of Revelation and decide what we think is figurative or should be figurative and what is literal. There are times in the book where God literally tells us or explains to us the figurative language. But the rest of the time, it says it's figurative, then that's what it is. Well, there are harps spoken of. In the 5th chapter of Revelation, and I'm going to begin reading at verse 8. It says, Now when he had taken the scroll, the 4 living creatures and the 24 elders fell down before the Lamb, each having a harp and golden bowls full of incense, which are the prayers of the saints. And they sang a new song, saying, You are worthy to take the scroll and to open its seals, for you were slain. You have redeemed us to God by your blood, out of every tribe and tongue and people and nation, and have made us kings and priests to our God, and we shall reign on the earth. All right, so you have these 24 elders, and they have a harp, and they have golden bowls full of incense, which he says are the prayers of the saints. He gives us an explanation there of what that is. But we have the harps and the bowls and the incense, and we have these 24 elders. Well, all of these things can be found in the Old Testament. And that's one of the things that the book of Revelation does. It takes things from the Old Covenant and brings them out, and it's applying them to new realities, all right? The realities in Jesus Christ. And it's exactly what the Hebrew writer said in Hebrews chapter 10 and verse 1, where he said that the old law was a copy, it was a shadow of the things to come, the good things to come, he says. And he was referring to the things in Christ, the new covenant. So we have these 24 elders. That is something taken straight out of the the Old Covenant. In 1 Chronicles chapter 24, the Bible talks about 24 orders of priests. They had 24 orders of priests, and there was a head, over each order of the priests. So you had 24 elders or 24 heads. And that's what we see here in the book of Revelation. The golden bowls were used in the service of God at the temple. Also the harps were used to praise God, and also they were commanded by God to give Him praise, and also they were many times part of prophecy and went hand in hand with prophecy. So all of these things that we see here in verse 8 are part of that copy and shadow of the good things to come in Jesus Christ. Well, there has been a change in the priesthood, and you can go to the book of Hebrews and read about that. Jesus Christ came in the likeness of a man called Melchizedek. Melchizedek was both king and priest, and he lived during the time of Abraham. Now, he lived before Levi, so he wasn't from the tribe of Levi, but rather he was still God's king and priest there at the time that Abraham was alive. Well, Jesus came in his likeness. Jesus is both king and priest. And the Hebrew writer in Hebrews chapter 7 and verse 12 says, since there's a change in the priesthood, there is also a change in the law. And so the law, the new covenant, is what was referred to there in Hebrews chapter 7. Well, you know, what we have represented in this text is the worship of God by these priests, these 24 elders, and they're doing on harps as they would have in the Old Testament. Harps were used for worship of God, and they sing this new song, and if you notice, as part of the song, they make mention of the fact that God has made us, in verse 20, made them kings and priests. Well, who is a priest today? Well, the only priests that exist today are those who have been baptized into Jesus Christ. Every Christian is a priest. In 1 Peter chapter 2, Peter talks about that. He calls Christians both a holy priesthood and a royal priesthood. Royal in respect to we serve under Jesus Christ the King and that relationship with Him, but also a holy priesthood. Let's take a look just briefly at 1 Peter chapter 2, and then I'll turn it over to you, Keith. 1 Peter chapter 2, where he makes reference of us being priests. Verse 5 says, you also, as living stones, are being built up a spiritual house, a holy priesthood, to offer up spiritual sacrifices acceptable to God through Jesus Christ. Well, in the Old Covenant, they offered physical sacrifices. In the Old Covenant, they used physical harps to worship God. They had the golden bowls, they had the altars, they had the censers. all these physical aspects of service to God. But today, as God's priest, every Christian is a priest of God, to offer up spiritual sacrifices. And what God has commanded us to do in the New Covenant, the New Testament, again, if there's a change in the priesthood, there's also a change in the law. And the new law states that we're to make melody in our hearts as opposed to using harps. Keith, I'll turn it over to you.
All right, thanks very much. Good discussion, Trevor. I want to stay for the time being right there in Revelation. I noticed, I believe, 3 references to harps in the book of Revelation. And Trevor's right that these are symbolic. And to drive this home, I want to look at Revelation chapter 14, verses 1 through 4. This is the vision that John had of the 144,000 along with the Lamb standing on the mountain, the Mount Zion. And I notice now this is the redeemed in heaven. That's the description that he's giving here. And I want you to notice how he describes the redeemed. He says, this is verse 4, these are the ones who are not defiled with women, for they are virgins. These are the ones who follow the Lamb wherever he goes. These were redeemed from among men, being firstfruits to God and to the Lamb. Now, if we take this literally, rather than symbolically, figuratively, then the redeemed in heaven are 144,000 exactly. And by the way, that's what the Jehovah's Witnesses believe. There's only 144,000 going to heaven. Everybody else has an inheritance on this earth. If we have any inheritance, that's the false doctrine of the Jehovah's Witnesses. But nonetheless, if that's also the case, notice, all of those redeemed are virgin men. And so if you're not a virgin male, you can't go to heaven. If you take literally the figurative speech, the symbolism of Revelation 14, 1 through 4. So the point is that Trevor's already made, that these references to harps in heaven in the book of Revelation are symbolic. They're figurative references. They're not to be taken literally. Well, what about the Old Covenant? Trevor made a good reference that actually instrumental music under the Old Testament was commanded of God. It's not something that they introduced, but rather something that God commanded them to have. In 2 Chronicles chapter 29, verse 25, we read of the restoration of the worship of God that took place under King Hezekiah. And notice this is 2 Chronicles chapter 29, verse 25. And I want you to see what was included in this restoration that took place at that time. There we read, and he stationed the Levites in the house of the Lord with cymbals, with stringed instruments, and with harps, according to the commandment of David, of Gad the king's seer, and of Nathan the prophet, for thus was the commandment of the Lord by his prophets. So, instrumental music under the Old Testament was commanded by the Lord through his prophets. Now, would somebody please show us where there is a command in the New Testament under the law of Christ, the covenant that we're under, that his people are to use any kind of instruments of music in worship. Rather, if we go back and try to be justified by what was done under the law, we have fallen from grace. That's what the Apostle Paul specifically says about it in Galatians chapter 5, verse 4. Whoever of you would be justified by the law, you have fallen from grace. We fall away from Christ if we try to justify what we do today by what the law says. But rather, under the New Testament, we're commanded specifically to sing in worship to God. God commanded us what he wants. There's several passages that do that. Let's look at Ephesians chapter 5, verses 18 and 19. Ephesians chapter 5, verses 18 and 19. And do not be drunk with wine, in which is dissipation, but be filled with the Spirit, speaking to one another in psalms and hymns and spiritual songs, singing and making melody in your heart to the Lord. Rather than making music, melody on a harp, we're to make music in our hearts as we sing to God. That's the command of the New Testament. And consistently, any time in the New Testament that we read concerning music and worship, it is always sing. God specifies what He wants. He does not give any authority whatsoever for instrumental music in worship. Well, Trevor, I hope that satisfies concerning that question concerning instrumental music. Is there something you would like to add on that?
No, I think that was good.
All right. Well, I believe we covered that question. So we want to take the time to go to a second question this evening. And that second question is a very good one as far as a personal application to our own personal lives. The question is, at what point in general conversation does the subject matter become and continue into gossip? So the questions concerning what is gossip and what constitutes gossip. So Trevor, please give us a good Bible answer on that question.
All right, concerning the subject of gossip, let's take a look at Psalm 15. The 15th Psalm, a Psalm of David, and beginning in verse 1, he says, Lord, who may abide in your tabernacle? Who may dwell in your holy hill? He who walks uprightly and works righteousness and speaks the truth in his heart. He who does not backbite with his tongue, nor does evil to his neighbor, nor does he take up a reproach against his friend. You know, at what point in a conversation does it turn into gossip? Well, we can talk about other people in a positive manner, or simply pass on the news. Somebody got a new truck, somebody bought a new house, those kinds of things. That's just general information. But when we injure someone, and that's the term backbite there in verse 3, to backbite is to injure someone behind their back. So I believe what the Bible teaches, and there are many other examples of this, but is when a conversation turns negative against another individual. Now we've begun to enter a sinful conversation. Our talk is now sinful. He also mentions there in verse 3, taking up a reproach against a friend. The idea of a reproach is to disgrace someone, to dishonor them, to bring them down in the eyes of others. And so that's what gossip is, really. You know, we're talking about other people's business, and it's in a negative fashion. It's not positive. It's not good information. We're trying to bring them down a bit and take them down a notch in the eyes of others. Well, that's the same idea that he's talking about here, taking up a reproach. Well, you'll notice what he said there in verse 1. This is actually a really scary text because gossip is so prevalent. But what he's saying here is if we're guilty of these things, go back to verse 1, we don't abide in the tabernacle of God, and we don't dwell in His holy hill, which is a reference to Zion there. The idea is these people are not God's people. God's people in the text are those who don't backbite. They don't take up a reproach. Their talk is not negative against their friends or neighbors or anyone for that matter. Keith, I'll turn it back to you.
Good reference, Trevor. And by the way, that Psalm 15 has sometimes been called the Beatitudes of the Old Testament, where the psalmist is giving a description of the one who dwells in Zion, the one who is a citizen of God's kingdom. And so if we're citizens of God's kingdom, then we do not do the things that the psalmist says those people don't do. And one of those things is backbiting with our tongue, speaking evil behind people's back. We just don't do that if we're citizens of the kingdom of heaven. So good reference, Trevor, and I'm glad you went there. Well, there's some New Testament passages that are parallel that we can look at to see that also under the New Testament this is forbidden. In 2 Corinthians chapter 12, verse 20, the Apostle Paul rebukes the Corinthians for a number of sins that were prevalent among the brethren in Corinth. One was gossip, and the other was backbiting. And so, another one was backbiting. So those things are still wrong under the New Testament. In James chapter 4, verses 11 and 12, James says, do not speak evil of one another, brethren. He who speaks evil of a brother and judges his brother speaks evil of the law, that is, in regard to the law, and judges the law, that is, you've set yourself up as a judge under the law. That's not my role. My role under the law of Christ is not to be the judge. Christ is the judge. My role is to be obedient to the law. And I've set myself up as a judge under the law if I'm going around speaking evil of my brothers and sisters in Christ. And so he says, if you judge the law, you're not a doer of the law, but a judge. There's one lawgiver. who is able to save and to destroy. Who are you to judge another? So we should not be speaking evil of one another, particularly behind one another's backs. Now, if I see my brother sin, then my obligation is to talk to that brother about his sin. In Galatians chapter 6, verse 1, if you who are spiritual, if you see anyone who has stumbled, then we are to talk to that person. That's Galatians chapter 6, verses 1 and 2. And in fact, if we know somebody's sin, we told to go to that person about his sin, we can save a soul from death, according to James. In James chapter 5, verses 19 and 20. You probably were told by your mother when you were a child, if you can't say something good about somebody, don't say anything at all. And I believe that's a good rule of thumb to keep in mind. And I believe that the New Testament carries through with that. Now, if I know something bad about a person, go to that person, talk to that person about it. But don't talk about that behind their backs to other people. Either say something good about that person or say nothing at all about that person. Well, Trevor, that really covers what I would like to say about that. I'm going to turn it back to you to cover the rest of this time on the program.
Well, you know, to go along with what you were just saying, Matthew chapter 7 and verse 12, Jesus told the people and taught them, whatever you want men to do to you, do also to them. And when in a conversation, we need to think about that as we're talking about things, and we may make mention of somebody, but, you know, is it acceptable? You know, is it something we wouldn't mind having said of us? You know, that's something to consider in our speech. But I want to go to 1 Timothy chapter 5. There's a text in 1 Timothy chapter 5 that literally uses the word gossip and also uses the word busybody. And in context, he is talking about younger widows. However, in verse 13, this is going to apply to both men and women. It was directed to younger widows at the time. The concern was that they not be busy enough and find themselves in sinful practices. So he was desiring that the younger widows marry and have children and manage the house and stay busy. Well, you know, this is just as true for both men and women, and today it's just as applicable that we need to keep busy. You know, we don't want to be idle because that opens us up to sin and temptation. But in verse 13, he says, and besides they learn to be idle, wandering about from house to house, and not only idle but also gossips and busybodies, saying things which they ought not. Now, there's something here in this text, as I said, we can apply to us today, both men and women, and that is that we can learn to be idle, and that's true, but also with that he says, not only idle, but they learn to be gossips and busybodies. You know, being a gossip is something we can put into practice, and it's a sinful practice. You know, God made us in such a way that we can train our bodies, we can train our minds, and we can create habits. You know, and what he wants us to do, and what is clearly taught in the Scriptures, is to create good habits in our lives and good practices. But we can learn to be a gossip. And I think our training in this begins the first time we open our mouths to gossip. The first time we become a busybody, well, now we've entered a very dangerous zone, and we could end up going down a very, very sinful path. So it's something we have to be careful we learn not to do. Now, on the flip side of this, we can train ourselves to not gossip. Every time I start to speak negatively about someone, or enters my mind to speak negatively or to speak evil or talk about someone else's sin or something they've done, if I catch myself, well, if I do that every time, eventually it's going to become easy for me just not to say anything negative at all about anybody and not bring up sinful things or sinful practices that I may see others involved in. I want to go over let's go to James actually. I changed my mind. Let me go to James chapter 3. And I know Keith was just over in James a moment ago, but in James chapter 3, James talks a lot about the tongue. And if we look here in verse 9 of James 3, he says, with our tongue, with our mouths in other words, with it we bless our God and Father, and with it we curse men who have been made in the similitude of God. Out of the same mouth proceed blessing and cursing. My brethren, these things ought not to be so. Does a spring send forth fresh water and bitter from the same opening? Can a fig tree, my brethren, bear olives, or a grapevine bear figs? Thus, no spring yields both salt water and fresh. Now, he's talking about cursing our fellow man, but I think gossip here can apply in the sense, he's talking about a sinful use of the tongue that's against our fellow man. Well, what does he say? With our tongues we bless God. Should we also turn around and backbite? Should we also turn around and gossip about our fellow man? No, not at all. Because that out of the mouth should not come both blessing and sin. And that's clearly what he's teaching there. So it's something we have to be very cautious of. There's another text, and we're kind of getting close on time, but it's the 10th proverb. The 10th proverb. Our tongues, our mouths, should be a blessing to society. That is to say that we should have a positive impact on those around us with the things that we say. And in the 10th proverb, and let's look at verse 11. He says, "The mouth of the righteous is a well of life, but violence covers the mouth of the wicked." The mouth of the righteous is a well of life. Our mouths should speak good things. They should speak truths, and they should have a positive impact on society and upon those around us. If you look further down in the text, in verse 18, he says, "Whoever hides hatred has lying lips, and whoever spreads slander is a fool." So in the context, he's talking about using our mouths for sinful purposes, slander, all right, speaking evil of others, lying. And what's interesting in verse 18 there is he says, "Whoever hides hatred has lying lips." I believe the same is true with those who gossip. The sinful use of the tongue. When we gossip, we're really hiding hatred. If we're speaking of evil of somebody, we don't really care about them. We don't truly love them. We don't love them the way we should. If we're exposing their faults or talking about their sins or anything that's negative about another individual, well, we're really hiding hatred. In verse 19, he says, "In the multitude of words, sin is not lacking, but he who restrains his lips is wise." Now that's true. The more we talk, the more we can get ourselves into trouble. And so he's warning of that. Be careful. Silence is golden. Sometimes it's better just to keep our mouths closed. And if we're ever in question about whether or not we should say something, we're in a conversation with somebody, and we start to talk about somebody else, and we think, "Oh, is this right? Should I say that about so-and-so?" Well, then we probably shouldn't. It's better to be silent in those kinds of instances. So I think the Bible is very clear that when our speech becomes negative, when it puts down others, when it talks of their sins, as Keith kind of brought out there, speaking evil of another individual, well, now we've entered a sinful territory. Now we have committed sin. And so gossip is sin, meddling in other people's affairs, busybodies, that kind of all goes together with that. So it's something we have to be cautious of.
Thanks so much, Trevor. Good discussion. We're about out of time on the program this evening. We'll make one observation, and then we'll call the program to a close. I know if somebody's talking bad about another person to me, if they were talking to another person about me, they would probably be saying something bad about me also. You might notice that. Thanks for listening and watching.
Thank you for watching Search the Scriptures. If you have a Bible question or comment, you may call 870-321-5746, email Keith Sharp at suddenlink.net, or write Keith Sharp at P.O. Box 263, Mountain Home, Arkansas 72654. And your question will be answered on the air. Be sure to watch next week at the same time for another edition of Search the Scriptures. Until then, the Lord bless you and keep you. The Lord make his face shine upon you and be gracious to you. The Lord lift up his countenance upon you and give you peace.